I need the money tomorrow, my daughter ordered, demanding I pay her husband's $400,000 debt. 4 hours later, I was at the airport, leaving them to find a locked door and a box on the porch that would make them scream. Before continuing, write where you are from or what time it is. I need the money tomorrow, my daughter Serena said. It wasn't a request. It was an order. Her voice was as cold and hard as the marble countertops in her impossibly minimalist kitchen. We were standing in the center of my living room, a space filled with warm books, real art, and the comfortable velvet armchair that had belonged to my late husband, Samuel. They hadn't sat down. They stood over me like a hostile negotiating team, radiating an aura of aggressive, desperate entitlement. Serena, my daughter, the 38-year-old brand curator, looked at me with a hard, impatient expectation. There was no shame in her eyes, no fear. Only the absolute certainty that her problem was about to be solved. She had just dropped a thick, leather-bound folder into my lap. It was heavy, with the terrifying official weight of someone else's disaster. Inside, I'd found the printout of an email. The subject line was a single, chilling phrase: final notice of acceleration and demand for payment. Behind it were loan documents, filled with predatory interest rates and punitive fees. At the bottom of the page, a final terrifying number was circled in red ink: $400,000. Tomorrow, I whispered, the word a small, choked sound. It wasn't just the amount, though it was staggering. It was the sheer, unadulterated audacity. Serena, this is a huge amount of money. It's not sitting in a checking account. It requires transfers. Before I could finish, her husband Damon moved. He stepped away from the fireplace, planting himself directly in front of my armchair. His large frame cast a long, intimidating shadow over me. The charming, beleaguered CEO mask was gone, replaced by something cold and menacing. And no delays, he added, his voice a low, dangerous growl. I flinched. He had never spoken to me like that. These are not the kind of people you keep waiting, he continued, leaning in just slightly. They are not a bank. They do not send polite registered letters. They have other methods of collection. The threat was clear, and it was two-pronged. He was implying that my failure to comply would have dire consequences for my daughter. He was making me responsible for their safety, a safety compromised by his own reckless, idiotic decisions. I looked at my daughter. She stood there, arms crossed, her expression one of unwavering support for her husband. She was his willing accomplice. They were a team. They had come into my home, my sanctuary, and turned it into the scene of a high-stakes shakedown. They weren't asking for help. They were demanding a ransom. They saw me not as a mother, but as a financial institution, a living, breathing ATM. And in that moment, something inside me, a part that had been dormant for decades, the part that had once been a brilliant, decisive, and unflappable neurosurgeon, woke up. The soft, accommodating, endlessly forgiving mother receded. The cold, precise mind of Dr. Elise Duval took control. I looked down at the terrifying red circle number. I looked back up at their hard, expectant faces. And I smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the calm, deeply unnerving smile of a surgeon who has just looked at a complex, life-threatening tumor and has seen, with sudden, brilliant clarity, the exact, precise line of incision. They stared, a flicker of confusion in their eyes. This wasn't the reaction they expected. They had expected tears, arguments, panic. They saw my lack of protest as capitulation. I let them believe it. Then I spoke the one word they were so confidently waiting to hear. "Okay," I said. The relief that washed over their faces was almost comical. Damon let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for hours. Serena's tense shoulders visibly relaxed. They shared a silent, arrogant glance. The old woman always comes through. They had their agreement. They had no idea that my quiet, simple okay was not a surrender. It was a declaration of war. Why did I agree? Because I finally understood. The life my daughter Serena had built was a masterpiece of modern fiction. Her home, a stark minimalist mansion of glass and white marble, wasn't a home. It was a gallery. A stage meticulously set for the unblinking eye of her social media followers. Every beige cashmere throw, every artfully placed orchid, was chosen not for comfort, but for its photogenic quality, its ability to communicate a fabricated narrative of effortless luxury. At 38, Serena was a brand curator, a title as vague as the life she purported to live. Her days were a performance. One week, she was posting from a sun-drenched infinity pool in Bali, the sponsored caption full of meaningless quotes about manifesting your best life. The next, she was in her all-white kitchen, arranging organic produce for a post about clean living. Her hundreds of thousands of followers saw a successful, self-made woman. They did not see the truth. They did not see the silent, invisible investor who funded the entire elaborate production. They did not see me. Her husband Damon, at 40, was her handsome co-star. He was a tech entrepreneur, a visionary always on the cusp of the next big disruptive idea, an idea that always seemed to require a significant and immediate injection of capital. My own life, as Dr. Elise Duval, was a study in contrast. I am a retired neurosurgeon. My world had been one of quiet, intense focus, of life or death decisions made under the harsh, unforgiving lights of an operating room. My success wasn't measured in followers, but in lives saved. My wealth, accumulated through a lifetime of disciplined work and shrewd private investing, was a quiet, private thing. After my husband Samuel's death a decade ago, lost in grief, I had made a decision born of love and fear. I established the Duval Family Trust. It was meant to be a foundation, not a crutch. Upon their 25th birthdays, both Serena and my son Adrian would receive a generous monthly stipend. The amount was substantial, $7,000 each, for a total of $14,000 a month. It was enough, I believed, to give them the freedom to build careers, to travel, to create, without the soul-crushing burden of student debt. I didn't want them to chase salaries. I wanted them to chase their passions. I had envisioned Serena using this freedom to start a real, impactful business. I had dreamed of Adrian finally producing the powerful, socially conscious documentaries he always spoke of. The money was meant to be a launch pad. I was giving them wings, and I waited with a mother's hopeful heart to watch them fly. But they had not flown. They had simply remained in the nest, a very comfortable, very expensive nest, and had forgotten that the wings were their own, not mine. The $400,000 demand wasn't a sudden break. It was the inevitable conclusion of a pattern I had allowed for years. My love had become a resource they learned to exploit with the casual confidence of a person flipping a light switch. A few months ago, a smaller, telling incident occurred. Serena had called me, her voice a whirlwind of non-negotiable plans. "Mom, you are not going to believe the space I found," she gushed. "It's the perfect location for my new consultancy, a ground-floor boutique space in the heart of the design district. It's a brand-defining move." Her consultancy was a business with no clients, no income, and no plan, but it had a magnificent brand identity. I knew what was coming next. "The thing is," she continued, her voice shifting to impatient necessity, "the landlords are a bit old-fashioned. They want a co-signer on the lease, a guarantor." "I see," I said, my voice carefully neutral. "So I'll email you the papers," she said. It was not a request. It was a line item on her to-do list. You just need to sign them and have them notarized. It's just a formality, really. We need to move fast. To refuse would be to stand in the way of her dreams. It would be an act of profound negativity. So, against the silent, screaming voice of my own financial prudence, I had signed. I, Dr. Elise Duval, had just personally guaranteed a 5-year, astronomically expensive commercial lease for a business that existed only on an Instagram feed. This was on top of the seed money from my son Adrian's perpetually in development documentary films, projects that never seemed to progress beyond their research phase, which always involved him traveling to exotic, photogenic locations. It was on top of the down payment for their first apartment, a loan that was never meant to be repaid. While I was funding their fantasies, Damon was funding his with real danger. His latest masterpiece was an app called Elysian. It promised to use AI to curate bespoke travel experiences for the ultra-wealthy. The problem, as with all of Damon's ideas, was that it was a black hole for cash. He hadn't funded it through traditional venture capital. He had funded it through a series of increasingly risky, high-interest, short-term loans from shady private lenders. These were not patient bankers. They were predators in expensive cars, men who operated in the gray, unregulated fringes of the financial world. I knew none of this, of course. Not yet. All I knew was that the performance of success was becoming strained. I would see the small signs of rot. A hushed, angry phone call Damon would take in the garden, his back to the house, his shoulders tense. A thick, official-looking envelope delivered by courier that he would quickly stuff into his briefcase, his face a mask. They weren't just living beyond their means. They were living in a different financial galaxy. A new leased Porsche appeared in the driveway. A lavish redecoration featured in a design blog. They were desperately trying to maintain the illusion of wealth to keep the wolves at bay. But the wolves were not just at the door. They were already inside, sitting at the table, and they were beginning to get impatient. The day the house of cards finally fell was a Thursday. Damon was in his home office, staring at his laptop, watching his world burn. The email had arrived an hour earlier. It was from his primary creditor, a shadowy firm with a deliberately intimidating name, Apex Global Ventures. The email was short, brutal, and uncompromising. The subject line, Final Notice of Acceleration and Demand for Payment. The body of the email laid out the stark, ugly terms of his ruin. He had missed his last 2 substantial interest payments. He was in profound and incurable breach of his loan agreement. As a result, they were exercising the acceleration clause. They were calling in the entire debt. The number, in a bold, angry font, was a staggering, indigestible figure, $400,000. It was the total principal, plus punitive late fees and a crippling predatory interest rate that had been compounding daily. The final paragraph was the one that made the blood drain from his face. It stated that the debt was now due and payable in full within 48 hours. If payment was not received by close of business on Friday, they would not just begin legal action. They would begin all necessary and appropriate actions to recover their assets. It was a polite corporate term for sending very large, very unfriendly men to his house to take his new Porsche, his wife's jewelry, and every other valuable object that was not nailed down. The charismatic mask of Damon, the tech visionary, dissolved. He was a cornered con man, and his wax wings had melted. He stumbled out of his office and found Serena in the living room. She was in the middle of a live stream, her face a mask of curated joy, dispensing advice on living your most authentic life. "We have a problem," he said, his voice a raw, strangled whisper. He held out his phone, the screen glowing with the death notice of their life. I can only imagine the scene that followed. The moment the cameras were off, the screaming, the accusations, the frantic panic of two people whose fraudulent world was about to be violently dismantled. But their panic, as it always did, quickly coalesced into a single unified solution. There was only one bank that had never failed them, only one lender who had never said no, who had never charged interest, who had never sent a threatening final notice. The bank of Mom, my bank. Their problem was not a problem they needed to solve. It was a problem they needed me to fix. They called me an hour later. It was Serena. Her voice was a strange, high-pitched, brittle instrument of forced, unnatural calm. "Mom," she said, a little too loud, "Damon and I need to have a little chat with you. A sort of urgent business meeting. It's rather time-sensitive." The phrase business meeting was a flashing red flag. This was not a social call. This was a summons. "Of course, darling," I said, my own voice calm. "I'm home all afternoon." "No," she said too quickly. "We'll come to you. We'll be there in an hour." They were on their way to make the withdrawal that would, they believed, save their lives. They arrived not in Serena's sporty convertible, but in Damon's large, black, intimidating SUV, a vehicle that always looked more like a gangster's getaway car. They pulled into my quiet driveway with a spray of gravel, an aggressive, jarring arrival. I greeted them in my living room, having prepared a tray of tea and lemon cakes out of sheer habit, a gesture of hospitality that felt absurd in the tense, charged atmosphere. They did not sit. They stood in the center of the room, radiating entitlement. Their eyes scanned the room not with warmth, but with the cold, appraising gaze of assessors. They weren't seeing a home. They were seeing assets. I sat in my husband's armchair and listened. Damon spoke first, standing by the fireplace, in a posture he had likely seen in a movie about powerful, beleaguered men. He spoke of unforeseen market headwinds and a sudden betrayal by a key institutional investor. He framed his own catastrophic failure as a perfect storm of bad luck. He was not a failure. He was a tragic hero. Serena then took over, her role to translate this corporate drama into a manipulative family matter. "The bottom line, Mom," she said, her voice full of false patience, "is that Damon's primary backer has pulled out, and he needs to cover a short-term loan. It's a bridge loan, just until the next round of funding comes through." A bridge loan. They were using the language of legitimate finance to describe a desperate bailout from a loan shark. Then came the demand. Serena walked over to me, all business. She was no longer my daughter. She was her husband's chief financial officer. She was holding that thick, leather-bound folder. She didn't hand it to me. She dropped it into my lap. I opened it. I saw the email. I saw the loan agreements. And I saw the number circled in red, $400,000. I looked up from the documents, my heart a cold, heavy stone. I looked at my daughter. Her face was a mask of hard, impatient expectation. "I need the money tomorrow," she said. An order. "Tomorrow?" I whispered. "Serena, this is a huge amount of money. I can't just produce it." That's when Damon stepped forward, casting his shadow over me. "And no delays," he growled. "These are not the kind of people you keep waiting. They have other methods of collection, methods that would be very, very unpleasant for all of us." He was threatening me, using his own stupidity as a weapon against me, holding my daughter's safety as emotional blackmail. And Serena just stood there, arms crossed, a full partner in the threat. For years, I had been the enabler. I had signed the leases, provided the seed money, funded the illusion. My love and my wealth had been a blank check. They had finally filled it in with an amount so staggering, so insulting, and a demand so brutal that it had finally triggered a stop payment in my heart. I looked at my daughter, her beautiful face devoid of any warmth or love. I looked at her husband, his handsome face a mask of thuggish menace. They were predators who saw me as a resource to be plundered. The surgeon woke up. The path to removing the cancer was clear. I looked up at their hard, expectant faces, and I smiled. A cold, precise, and deeply unnerving smile. They faltered, confused, but their desperation quickly reasserted itself. They saw my smile, my lack of protest, as capitulation. "Okay," I said, my voice quiet. It was a thunderclap of victory in their ears. Damon's shoulders relaxed. Serena smiled, triumphant. They had won. The Bank of Mom had come through again. They had no idea. My okay was not acceptance. It was the sound of a scalpel being drawn. The moment the front door closed, the moment their black SUV sped away with a spray of gravel, the calm, compliant mask dropped. Dr. Elise Duval was back on duty. I was about to perform the most precise and ruthless operation of my life. I did not waste a single second on grief or hesitation. The time for emotion was over. The time for action was now. My movements were a study in cold, precise efficiency, the muscle memory of a lifetime in high-stakes situations taking over. My first call was not to my lawyer. It was to a high-end, discreet travel concierge service. A woman named Isabel, whose job it was to make the impossible happen, answered on the first ring. "Isabel, it's Elise Duval," I said, my voice all business. "I have an emergency. I need a one-way first-class ticket to Geneva, Switzerland, leaving tonight. The earliest possible flight." Geneva was not a random choice. It was my escape hatch. I had a small, beautiful apartment there overlooking the lake. More importantly, I had a Swiss bank account, a fortress of financial privacy that my children knew nothing about. "Of course, Dr. Duval," Isabel said unfazed. "I'm on it. I will have a confirmation and a car service at your door at 7 p.m. I hung up. Step 1, exfiltration, was in motion. My second call was to Mr. Ben Carter, the fiercely loyal and utterly discreet manager of my private wealth and the Duval Family Trust. He had been my late husband's most trusted advisor and had become my own. He, too, answered on the first ring. "Mr. Carter," I said, my voice a blade of ice, "it has happened." I could hear the sharp, imperceptible intake of his breath. "I see, doctor," he said, his voice a low, grim murmur. He did not sound surprised. He sounded ready. "Here are my instructions," I said, my words clear, precise, and irrevocable. "I am emailing you the folder of documents I just received. They detail a personal debt of $400,000 owed by my son-in-law. I want you to use the discretionary fund of my personal account, not the family trust," I commanded. "I want you to contact these creditors immediately. Use whatever means necessary. I want you to buy my son-in-law's entire outstanding debt, all of it. I want our financial entity to become his sole creditor by the end of business today." There was a moment of profound, and I am sure deeply satisfied, silence on his end. "Consider it done, Dr. Duval," he said, and his voice was a low purr of pure professional pleasure. "I will handle it personally and with extreme prejudice." The surgical strike was in motion. I was not just refusing their demand. I was executing a move of such cold, strategic genius it had likely never even occurred to their greedy minds. I was not just closing the Bank of Mom. I was becoming the new and far more formidable debt collector. The beauty of the plan was its elegant and brutal simplicity. By buying Damon's debt, I was transforming myself from his primary financial resource into his new and far more powerful master. The shady, threatening lenders he was so terrified of, The ones he had used as a weapon to intimidate me would be gone. They would be paid off in full with my money. For a few brief, glorious hours, Damon would believe he was safe, that my okay meant a simple, consequence-free bailout. But the debt itself, the $400,000 chain around his neck, would not be gone. It would simply be transferred. The ownership of that debt would be moved in a legally binding transaction to the Duval Family Trust. And I, Dr. Elise Duval, was the sole trustee. I was no longer the emotional, easily manipulated mother. I was the primary and sole creditor. I held all the cards. I could call the loan in at any time. I could dictate the repayment terms. I could, if he missed a single payment, initiate the very asset seizure and legal ruin he had been so terrified of. I owned his failure. While Mr. Carter's team of legal sharks began the swift, aggressive work of executing the buyout, I began to prepare the final symbolic act. I went to my study, but not to pack. My apartment in Geneva was a second life, fully stocked and waiting. All I needed was my passport and my purse. Instead, I looked for a box. In my walk-in dressing room, I found it on a high shelf, a beautiful, empty designer shoebox. It was from a pair of ridiculously expensive shoes I had bought in Paris years ago and never worn. It was a perfect, elegant, and deeply ironic vessel for the message I was about to send to my brand-obsessed daughter. The box was a glossy black thing, the name of a famous French designer embossed on the lid in elegant silver script. It was a symbol of the world they so desperately wanted to inhabit. It was a box that promised a priceless treasure inside. I began to pack this box with the cold, detached precision of a curator. Each item was chosen for its specific, brutal meaning. First, I printed the email that had just arrived from Mr. Carter. The buyout was complete. I printed the entire multi-page file, the new, official, legally binding debt transfer documents. The papers showing that Damon's $400,000 debt was now irrevocably owed to the Duval Family Trust. I folded them neatly and placed them at the bottom. This was the foundation of their new reality. Next, I went to an antique box where I kept old mementos. I found what I was looking for, a small, plastic, and deeply unglamorous prepaid bus pass. It was from a research trip to London years ago, a symbol of a life without private cars, a life where one had to wait, to plan, to move with the masses. I placed it on top of the legal papers. Then came the final item. Mr. Carter, in his enthusiasm, had already secured the next piece. His real estate division had finalized a 1-month prepaid lease on a small, bleak, but clean one-bedroom apartment in a low-income complex on the far unfashionable side of the city. It was the absolute polar opposite of their minimalist glass mansion. The keys now sat on my desk. They were attached to a cheap, flimsy plastic tag. On the tag, written in shaky blue ballpoint pen, were the words, Apt 1C, 452 Arbor Street. I dropped them into the box. They landed with a small, pathetic plastic clatter. The exhibit was complete. A beautiful designer shoebox containing not exquisite shoes, but a thick stack of life-altering debt papers, a cheap bus pass, and the keys to a life of profound, shocking mediocrity. It was a box full of hard, cold, inescapable consequences. 4 hours after my children had walked out of my house, their hearts full of triumphant, greedy relief, I was gone. The sleek black car from the concierge service glided silently away from the curb, leaving my beautiful, dark, and empty home behind. I did not look back. The airport, from the privileged sanctuary of the first-class check-in, was a sea of calm. My passport was stamped with a polite, deferential thud. I moved through it all with a strange, dreamlike detachment. I was a ghost, seamlessly and silently disappearing from my own life. I sat in the quiet, exclusive lounge, a glass of very expensive champagne in my hand. I made my final call. "Mr. Carter," I said, my voice a calm murmur. "I'm at the airport. My flight to Geneva leaves in 1 hour." "I trust your travels will be pleasant, Dr. Duval," he said, his voice a model of discretion. "And I can confirm that all your instructions have been carried out. The trust now legally and irrevocably owns Mr. Damon's entire outstanding debt." "Excellent," I said, a small cold smile touching my lips. "Then there are just a few final instructions for the morning." "I'm at your service, doctor." "First," I said, my voice as precise as a surgical instrument, "tomorrow morning at precisely 9:01 a.m., I want you to dispatch a bonded locksmith to my house. He is to change all the locks, the main doors, the garden gates, the garage, everything. My children's keys are, as of that moment, to be rendered completely useless." "A locksmith." 9:10 a.m. Consider it done. Second, I have left a box on the small table in the front entryway. It is a black designer shoebox. It is for my daughter and her husband. Instruct the locksmith that his final task is to place that box on the center of the front porch, where they cannot possibly miss it. A black shoebox on the porch. Understood. And finally, Mr. Carter, as of my departure tonight, you are to forward all my personal and professional mail to my new permanent address in Geneva. The house on Rosewood Lane is no longer my primary residence. Please also inform my housekeeper and gardener, and assure them their positions are secure. Their salaries will be increased by 10% as a bonus for their loyalty. I had not just left for a trip. I had immigrated. I had, in a few short surgical hours, completely erased myself from the life they had taken for granted. "All instructions will be followed to the letter, doctor," he said, and I could hear the profound, satisfied respect in his voice. "Thank you, Ben," I said, using his first name for the first time in our 30-year professional relationship. "I'll be in touch when I land." I hung up the phone. A quiet, polite voice over the lounge's intercom announced the final boarding call for my flight to Geneva. I stood up, my small carry-on bag in my hand, and walked toward the gate, toward my new life. I felt no sadness. I felt no regret. I felt only a vast, liberating sense of peace. The operation was a success. The patient, my own life, which had been suffering from a malignant cancer of entitlement, had been saved. The next morning, at precisely 10 a.m., a gleaming black Range Rover pulled up to the curb in front of my house. Serena and Damon got out. They were a picture of triumphant casual chic, the very embodiment of a life lived without consequence. Serena was in a stylish all-white pantsuit, her face hidden behind enormous designer sunglasses. Damon was in a crisp linen shirt, his expression one of relaxed, arrogant confidence. They were here to collect their prize. They were here to pick up their check for $400,000. They had given me my orders, and they assumed, with the unshakable faith of the chronically entitled, that I had followed them. They walked up the stone path to my front door. Serena reached the door first. She took out her key, the key to her childhood home, and slid it into the lock. She turned it. Nothing happened. The key met the solid, unyielding resistance of a lock that no longer recognized it. A small, ugly frown of annoyance creased her perfect brow. "What the?" she muttered. "Mom must have put the deadbolt on." She stepped back and rang the doorbell. Not a polite press, but a series of sharp, impatient, demanding jabs. The cheerful chime echoed from within the silent, empty house, but the door remained closed. Damon, a look of irritation on his face, tried his key. The result was the same. Their confident expressions began to falter, replaced by a dawning, irritated confusion. "What the hell is going on?" Damon growled. "She knew we were coming." He rattled the handle with frustrated, impotent anger. They peered through the sidelight windows, but the house was dark, the curtains drawn. The world, for the first time in their adult lives, was not conforming to their expectations. The Bank of Mom was inexplicably closed. It was Damon who saw it first. His eye settled on the object that had been placed in the precise geometric center of the welcome mat. "What's that?" he said, pointing. There, sitting with a stark, minimalist elegance that would have otherwise appealed to my daughter's aesthetic, was the box. A single, glossy black shoebox. On top of the lid was a small, simple cream-colored card. Written in my neat surgical script were 4 simple words. For Serena and Damon. "What the hell is this?" Serena said, her voice a mixture of annoyance and a new rising apprehension. "Is this some kind of game? A scavenger hunt for the money?" "Maybe the check is inside," Damon said, his own anxiety now palpable. Serena walked up the steps and picked up the box. It was surprisingly heavy. She was a woman who had been promised nearly $500,000, and she had been given a shoebox. They didn't open it on the porch. They walked back to their car, a private space for what they still desperately hoped would be a private, lucrative transaction. They got in and placed the box on the center console between them. Serena looked at the elegant silver lettering of the designer's name, a symbol of the very life she was so desperate to maintain. A flicker of hope returned. Maybe it was a gift, with the very large check tucked inside. With a hand that was not quite steady, she lifted the lid. For a long, silent moment, they just stared. Their minds, so attuned to the language of luxury, could not process the strange, ugly, and deeply insulting collection of objects inside. The first thing Serena saw, lying on top like a cheap plastic shroud, was the bus pass. She picked it up between her thumb and forefinger as if it were a dead insect. "What the hell is this?" she whispered. "Is this a joke?" Beneath it was the set of keys, not the heavy keys to a new car, but a cheap, flimsy set on a plastic tag, the ugly handwritten scrawl of final, brutal insult. And then they saw what was underneath. A thick, terrifying stack of legal documents. Damon, his hands now trembling, lifted them out. His eyes scanned the top page. He saw his name. He saw the names of his vicious, threatening, and now fully paid-off creditors. But then he saw the new page, the cover sheet attached to the front. He saw the official, intimidating letterhead of the Duval Family Trust. And he saw the legal jargon-filled paragraph that explained in cold, inescapable terms that the ownership of his debt, his failure, his ruin, had been legally and completely transferred. "What is it?" Serena hissed, her eyes still fixed on the pathetic plastic keys. Damon's handsome, tanned face had gone a pale, sickly greenish white. He couldn't speak. He just handed her the papers. She read them. Her perfectly glossed lips moved silently. Her mind, so attuned to branding and social media engagement, struggled with the hard, ugly language of financial obligations. And then she understood. Her mother had not paid off the debt. She had bought it. She was not their savior. She was their new creditor. The box was not a gift. It was an invoice and a set of instructions for their new, profoundly impoverished life. The scream, when it came, was not a human sound. It was a raw, guttural, and utterly primal roar of pure animalistic horror and rage. It was the sound of 2 chronically entitled, completely unprepared people, suddenly and violently, being confronted with the first real, devastating consequence of their entire pampered, fraudulent lives. They screamed, and they screamed, there in the quiet luxury of their Range Rover, on the tree-lined street, in front of the beautiful, locked house that was no longer their bank. The final scene of this story does not take place on that street. It takes place in a beautiful, serene apartment overlooking the placid blue expanse of Lake Geneva. It is a beautiful morning. I am sitting on my balcony, a cup of strong black coffee in my hand. The air is cool, clean, and profoundly peaceful. This is my new beginning. My phone, a new private device, buzzes softly on the glass table. It is not a frantic, abusive call from my daughter. It is a discreet, encrypted email from Mr. Ben Carter. The subject line is simple and deeply satisfying. Update on the DT account. The body of the email is equally concise. Good morning, Dr. Duval. I trust you are settling in well. This is to confirm that the first monthly debt repayment of $5,000 from Mr. and Mrs. Damon Thorne, as per the aggressive repayment schedule we have established, is due on the first of the upcoming month. Shall I send the first official and legally binding reminder notice? I look out at the calm blue water. I think of my daughter and my son-in-law, now in their small, bleak apartment on Arbor Street. Damon, I am sure, is desperately looking for a real job for the first time in his life. Serena is discovering the quiet, humbling horror of a life where her brand has no currency. It is the hardest and most necessary gift I have ever given them. I pick up my phone. My fingers, the same fingers that once performed miracles of precision in the human brain, are steady. I type one single, beautiful, and utterly final word in response to Mr. Carter's email. Absolutely. I press send. The sun is warm on my face. A new day and a new life has begun. If this story resonated with you, leave a like and consider subscribing. You can also drop any comment below, even just one word. Maybe tell me where you're watching from, or what time it is right now. Sometimes one word is enough to say you were here.